What is up, everybody? I'm NoLucksGiven here with your afternoon snap, and here with an upside down Lily hanging out. We've got a brand new season of Marvel Snap, Thunderbolts, and with that, I think a lot of channels are talking about Baron Zemo, the new season pass card. Except here at NoLucksGiven, we do things a little bit different. I am staying free to play. So instead of talking about the best decks to play Baron Zemo in, we're going to talk about the best cards to play against Baron Zemo. He's got a really interesting on-reveal ability: recruit the lowest cost card from your opponent's deck to your side of this location. And I'm going to go over the best cards to trick Baron into recruiting. I think the best first example to start with, just to get everybody on the same page, is Bast. Bast is a cheap card that you can build around. It's typically seen in Cerebro decks, and it will also grief your opponent if Baron Zemo recruits this card. It'll set all of their big cards to 3 power, and then from there, your opponent will be kind of in an awkward position unless they have like Luke Cage or Shadow King to undo the damage that Bast does. So I think that Bast in particular is a really strong card. Also, kind of specifically because the decks that wind up playing Bast also don't play any other one-cost cards. So your opponent is going to be guaranteed to hit Bast if they play their Baron Zemo, and it also only adds 1 power to their side of the board. So I think that Bast is a really strong card to consider. And actually, I said that they don't play any other one-cost cards. Oftentimes, Bast decks will play Wasp, because it's a cool way to give yourself a 3-power Wasp. They're kind of a good combo with each other. And I do also think that Wasp is pretty good against Baron Zemo because you're not giving your opponent that much. You're only giving them a 1-power card at the cost of a slot at that location. So it's not really that great. At the same time, I don't really recommend playing high evolutionary Wasp. That's obviously going to be a lot stronger. And the other thing that I just wanted to, I guess, like temper some expectations around is playing Jane Foster. Oftentimes Wasp is played alongside Jane Foster, and that in itself isn't bad, but don't play Thor. Don't play Stormbreaker Bill and try to shuffle the Mjolnir or Stormbreaker into your deck, or Beta Ray Bill it's called, right? Don't play those because then your opponent is just going to wind up stealing those cards from the Baron Zemo, which isn't like the best use of Baron, but it's not that great if you're kind of building your deck around those things with Jane and Odin to take further advantage. But if you were just playing Wasp and Lockjaw, or Wasp and Bast, I think that that is a great way to take advantage of Baron Zemo. Okay, we'll go into, so I think that this is one of the spicier picks, but I'm just going to go in order that I have the cards here in the deck. SpiderHam. This is a really, really potentially powerful card with Baron Zemo because you can build your deck to take advantage of getting SpiderHammed, which might be a little bit silly. But it's pretty cool to be able to both play SpiderHam in your deck, and then if you don't have the SpiderHam and your opponent tries to steal it from you, again, you're only giving them 1 power, but you can have the idea in the back of your mind that your opponent might try to SpiderHam you, and you could, with that, play cards like Infinite. This could be like a War Machine deck as well, doing some other things. We're going to see some other cards in a moment, or talk about some other cards at least that are good with War Machine. So I'm kind of interested in that, and I'm curious if anyone will take me up on that, playing SpiderHam alongside cards that you want to get SpiderHammed in the hopes that your opponent is going to Zemo ham you. And one strategy that is kind of similar to that is Echo. You could play Echo, it will guaranteed get recruited, and then you can use Echo to remove the ongoing abilities from your cards, like the typical ones that Shuri Sauron typically plays. Sorry, blanking on all the names as everything's run through my head here, but that's going to be Red Skull and the 410 Typhoid Mary. So you can play Echo in your deck just as kind of like a cool tech card. Echo is just a reasonable card that you can play, but if your opponent steals it, then you'll get to take full advantage of Echo. So that seems pretty sweet to me. One that I think is interesting, but not always going to work out, is Blade. So Blade has a drawback, right? It's a build around effect, but it is a drawback, especially if your opponent is not preparing for it. Now, why I think that Blade in particular is a little bit awkward is because it is typically played with Black Knight. Blade Black Knight decks you probably want to stay away from, because 50-50 that they steal the Black Knight, and they're only stealing a 1-2. If you're playing Blade alongside like Mike or something, then it's 50-50 that they steal Mike. Those things are fine. Giving them a 3-power card from Blade might not be fine, so that's why I'm like not totally sure on Blade exactly, but I did want to bring it up as a really cheap card with a really awkward drawback that your opponent won't be able to play around. Another really interesting drawback is Zero, taking away the abilities from whatever it is the next card is that your opponent plays. And one thing that I also think is really cool about this, now this is a little bit scary, a little bit spicy, but you can, when you are playing Zero decks, typically you're also playing Ebony Maul in those decks as your 2 cheapest cards. And this is great because unlike the Black Knight and Mike examples, both sides of the coin have drawbacks here. Either your opponent is locking themselves out of a location, or they are zeroing whatever it is the next card that they are hoping to play. I did say also that we're going to talk about some other War Machine cards later on in this video, because I already brought up the SpiderHam Infinite examples. Maybe if Baron Zemo gets super popular, you could make some crazy deck to take advantage of that with Zero, Ebony Maul, War Machine, SpiderHam, and that silliness, because Ebony Maul is another card that's pretty great if your opponent happens to SpiderHam it. Not a typical way that you get around the Ebony Maul restriction. Another card that also goes really well with Zero is Titania, and Titania has, I will say, the upside of being a more flexible card. More decks can just afford to play Titania and get away with just putting this card in their deck. I think that this is... Now what's weird about this is it's not all upside to give your opponent a Titania. It's rather weird and kind of hard to prepare for, but it's definitely just something to think about, something to have in the back of your mind here as we continue throughout the season. One other, so there's some other 1-drops that I did want to bring up. One in particular, like, I'm not totally sure, I'm not totally sold on this as I'm scrolling. They made it a 1-2, Squirrel Girl. The benefit of having Squirrel Girl get recruited is, one, it's probably going to be better in your deck than it's going to be in your opponent's deck. Same thing with Wasp. You can play both of these cards alongside Patriot. Did not mention that with Wasp, but that's a great way to make sure that your Wasps are better than the potential Wasps that are going to get recruited from your deck, just playing some synergies. Squirrel Girl's the same thing, and actually the Squirrels can be kind of a detriment if your opponent is not really willing to just have all of their space taken up, if they're not prepared for that. Not sure how long that was frozen for, but the next card that I want to talk about is Selene. Now what's really cool about Selene is it is a symmetrical on reveal ability, which means it doesn't matter if you reveal your Selene or your opponent reveals your Selene for you. It can actually be a great thing as long as you have one of those goblins in your hand that you are giving that negative power to. You don't care if your opponent flips over your Selene. then either way, you are shrinking one of the cards in their deck, and you're pumping up your own Green Goblin. And Green Goblin could potentially be a little bit, and Hobgoblin as well. Both of these can be a little bit more awkward in a world where Baron Zemo is filling locations, but they can also be better. Just because your opponent is running out of space, same kind of thing with Squirrel Girl, just trying to deny your opponent space in a deck where they're a little bit more likely to be clogging themselves, I think can be really good. There's actually a bunch of symmetrical cards on tier 3. We're going to talk about some of them, but I want to talk about some other griefing cards first, and probably the best griefing card in the game is going to be Havoc. If you can make your opponent recruit your Havoc, then you just win. It's pretty incredible, and I think that Havoc could potentially even be playable if Baron Zemo is a really respected part of the metagame. As you can see, I do not own Havoc because Havoc is kind of a terrible card, and I will almost say I do think Havoc is probably like an honorable mention more than it's something you should actually be looking to take advantage of, just because the Havoc lists that I've seen aren't that great. There are some players that have had like some success with Havoc, but for the most part, it's not that good of a card, and the decks that are playing it, you wouldn't be guaranteed to hit Havoc off of Baron, also because you kind of have to play a lower curve in order to facilitate playing Havoc, which means that it's going to be less likely to be recruited. But it is a really cool idea, and probably the best possible way to grief a Baron Zemo. And when I see somebody do it, I will give them upvotes and retweets and all that stuff, because that's just a lot of fun. One other really interesting way to potentially grief a Baron is Pixie. Now, Pixie could be a little bit awkward, but it is another interesting way to take advantage of Wasp. I forgot there were going to be so many Wasp synergies in this video. Pixie's a little bit scary to me, because if you Pixie flip and then your opponent recruits with Baron, then you could be looking at giving your opponent something really, really good, which is like the opposite of what this video is trying to do. And Pixie decks have kind of a weird curve, so I don't think all of the pieces to this are there just yet. However, if you can get your opponent to recruit Pixie, you could be in for a pretty good grief. However, a lot of the uses that I've seen for Baron so far have like a pretty middling curve where basically everything costs the same. I've seen it in a few Silver Surfer lists. So I'm not sure if this idea has everything that is needed, but still something that I wanted to bring up. Next is another symmetrical effect, and that's going to be Hazmat. Similar thing with Selene. If either player flips up the Hazmat, it's going to afflict all other cards, and then of course you're looking to take advantage of that with a Luke Cage to make that affliction only on your opponent's side of the board. So that is still going to work just the same. Here's another one that is a pretty interesting on-reveal drawback ability. Your opponent draws 2 cards. Well, that now means that you get to draw 2 cards. This is giving your opponent a bunch of power at the Baron location. That's going to be an 11 power out of 2 cards with Maximus plus Baron. The drawing 2 cards is pretty sweet, and there's a lot that you can come up with. I will say, I don't think that the mill version of Baron is going to be the most successful one at the end of the day. The one playing Gladiator and Yondu and Absorbing Man. I don't think that that's going to wind up being the most successful build. I think that it will probably just be like a Silver Surfer build that maybe can sometimes do that, but isn't looking to actively do that, and is just looking to use Baron as like another sort of Gladiator, in that it is a 3-cost card that adds about 8 power to the board. So I think that that is where we will see Baron fall ultimately. And I just bring that up because like with a Maximus, you'd then like not be able to take advantage of this drawback if they're going to mill out your entire deck anyways. But I don't see that really being the way that this goes. there is another really interesting symmetrical effect in Wave. Now, Wave, we're getting into 3 cost cards. This could be a little bit spicy, a little bit pricey. However, I just mentioned Gladiator. What if your deck starts its curve at Gladiator, Wave, and Electro, and then has a bunch of really expensive cards that you're planning on ramping out into? That's already kind of a curve that we have sometimes seen in some decks. You could potentially play Pixie in that deck, just throw it in as a potential Baron Grief option. But what is really cool here is, again, if your opponent pulls the Wave, then you'll get to play a big card on turn 4 regardless. And it actually just gives you like more chances at drawing your Wave. And one other reason that I mentioned Gladiator in this deck is, imagine that like your misses there, or your hits for Baron, I'm not sure which way to word it, but imagine that your opponent could hit Wave, Electro, or Gladiator, and then Gladiator can only hit Wave, Electro, or some huge card that you're planning on ramping into. Now, not all of those cards that you typically ramp into are going to be able to survive a Gladiator, like a Dr. Doom, for instance, but Dr. Doom kind of does survive a Gladiator, sending those 2 Doom bots to another location. So I do think that Wave as a tech card for Baron, making your curve just really, really high, does carry some risks, but could be really, really sweet. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this video, I think it's the last thing. There's some other cards like Master Mold I thought was kind of interesting as like a sort of Maximus, but not really. There's also Goose, which is a symmetrical effect. And then I mentioned there's other symmetrical effects on tier 3. I'll bring up some of those before we get into the spiciest pick of the video. And so like Armor, that's kind of interesting because then you've armored the lane. Magic is good unless your opponent is playing the mill version of Baron, but otherwise, like, you don't care. Let's make the location Limbo. Sounds good for me. Sauron is also kind of a cool hit, and I guess like my initial thought was that Sauron, oh, that's right off screen for you. My initial thought was that Sauron was too expensive to really care about Baron, but you think about a typical Shuri Sauron list, the bottom cards of the curve are also all fine for Baron to hit. Zero, Ebony Maul, Armor, Sauron. That's typically the bottom of the curve there. Sometimes with like a Sunspot or something, you wouldn't want to play that in the list, though I haven't really seen Sunspot in those lists in a long time. Sometimes they play Nebula or something. Debris is a symmetrical effect. Jean Grey is a symmetrical effect. All right. Let's get to the spiciest pick. One of the best things that you can have your opponent recruit with Baron Zemo, or Zemu, whatever the hell it's called. Zabu is what I'm getting at here, though. That's why whatever, some Baron Zabu? I don't know. Baron Zabu. Let's call it Baron Zabu from now on, because I'm forgetting the name of the brand new card. New season just started here. Forgive me. Zabu. Your 4 cost cards cost 1 less. One of the best cards in Marvel Snap. Why in the world would you want your Zabu recruited? Well, there's an interesting thing about curves in Marvel Snap. So if you draw your own Zabu and you play it on turn 2, maybe turn 3, great. You're in a great spot to win that game. However, if you don't draw that Zabu early on, you don't really want to draw it later on either, because sure, you could play Zabu plus a 4 cost card on turn 6. That's really not moving the needle. That's really not exciting anybody. On turn 5, you could play Zabu plus a 3 cost card, or you could just play one of your 4 cost cards. And then on turn 4, again, same thing, you can just play one of your 4 cost cards. So by having your Zabu recruited on turn 3, on turn 4, potentially even turn 5, what that's actually doing is it's thinning your deck, and it's taking a card out of your deck that you don't want drawn So that way the power of the remaining draws in your deck is just that much higher. And if we take a look at, let me move some things around here on the screen. If we take a look at this tribunal list, and I'll move some things around. Yeah, there we go. That gets it all on the screen. So this list is like a very fun combo list that I've been playing since unlocking Miss Marvel, and I think it's very good. Both of these Zabu hits, or both of these Baron hits, are really not that great for your opponent because they're not going to be able to take advantage of these things nearly as well as your own deck is. And because they get them out of your deck, it then makes it much more likely for your Iron Lad to hit exactly what you're looking for on the final turn of the game, and for your Jubilee to pluck out exactly what you were looking for in the exact same way. So something like this, despite not seeming like it initially, can actually be a really, really good anti-Baron deck. There is the issue of the mill Baron decks and playing a Magic deck. That doesn't quite cut it, but otherwise, there's taking your Zabu or your Ravonna, both of which you're fine with because you don't really want those off curve, or they're taking a 0 power Mystique. That's fine. They're taking your Magic for you, which is great. It does what Magic needs to do and thins your deck, or they're taking Wave, which I already brought up is another symmetrical card and another card that you were totally fine with them stealing. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, kind of an interesting take on the new season, kind of talking about all of the ways that the season pass card is bad, but this is how I view the game as a free-to-play player. I'm always looking at, okay, what new cards are coming in and how can I use my existing collection and my existing decks to take advantage of what my opponents are potentially trying to do. That's going to be it for me today. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm NoLucksGiven. Peace.